For those of you I have not met, my name is Melinda Hemmelgarn, and I have the great honor of serving on the Beyond Pesticides board. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for attending our Beyond Pesticides meeting this year. But I want to take a special moment to offer thanks to Jay Feldman for organizing this forum. And of course, great things don't happen in solidarity, in isolation. It comes from working in solidarity with others, and that would include the staff at Beyond Pesticides under Jay's leadership, Garrett White, Drew Toher, Max Athart, and all of the others that were involved in this, as well as my fellow board members. I know what everybody is ready for. Everyone's ready for a happy ending, right? You know, I often hear that when we hear these studies, these scientific studies with negative implications about pesticides, people, I'll talk about them and sometimes people's eyes glaze over and they'll say that I'm giving them bad news. But really the first step for change is being informed, right? And our last keynote speaker, for those of you who stayed for the whole beautiful Saturday, you're in for a real treat. I have the pleasure of knowing Philip Ackerman-Leist. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him after he wrote his first book, or the first book I was aware of, Rebuilding the Food Shed. And even though we're going to be talking about a different book tonight, I highly recommend that book because it gives us hope for how to rebuild the future we want to see. Dr. Philip Ackerman-Leist is the author of A Precautionary Tale: How One Small Town Banned Pesticides, Preserved Its Food Heritage, and Inspired a Movement. That's what he'll be talking about tonight. More than that, he'll be talking about how narratives, how our personal stories move us forward, what we've all experienced over the last day and a half. He is a professor of sustainable agriculture and food systems at the beautiful Green Mountain College in Pulteney, Vermont, where he founded a 23-acre organic college farm and the first online graduate program in food systems in the United States. He is going to give us a manifesto of sorts to take us on until our next forum. And I just want to thank you for your work. And I want to thank everyone here. Get ready. We have got a great speaker coming up.
Oh boy, the bar is high. And the bar's outside, that's even worse. That's the only worst thing than being between people and food is people in the bar, I guess. So really a pleasure to be here with you tonight. And in fact, it's an honor. And I have to thank Beyond Pesticides because the first conference that I came to was in Maine 2 years ago, as I was really getting rolling with this book. And it was such a critical experience for me being in Maine then. It provided me with a network that I didn't have before that. It provided me with references, with resources, and then also with very real people who I found out were real people that I could reach out to as I needed to. And that made all the difference. And then the other thing is the YouTube videos that are there and archived are one of the best resources out there, the different speakers who've been there. And I tapped those things, and I didn't look at them while I was driving, but I was listening all the time driving around to YouTube videos from Beyond Pesticides over the years to try to make sure I was up to speed. And then finally, there also was one quote from Warren Porter that stuck with me, and I heard him say it here again, and it was something that just was a bit of a beacon, and I'll tell a little more about that later, but that was very important. So I'm really grateful because if the book does what I hope it does for the people of Maltz, for the people of Irvine, for others, then it really is a testament also to the work that Beyond Pesticides has been doing as a resource. So thank you, Jay, and everyone else. And I also want to thank Kim, Christina, Bob, and all the others who are here in Irvine. It's just meant so much to hear that story, and I hope there's some parallels and potentially some lessons here for you to pick up. And maybe even most of all to the young people who spoke today. That was one of the most meaningful things that I've heard. It was incredibly powerful. And as I left the world of pesticides for a while, for about 20 years, it was not a world that I wanted to be in. I didn't want to talk about it or think about it. And what I decided as I started to write this book was that, I've had 20 years of solace in some ways in the organic world, and it's time for the old folks to come back in and do some of the bulldogging that has to be done out there. I think you'll find joy in doing the organic agriculture, and that's where you can lead the way. And let us get bruised and bullied as much as you want, but you just have done a tremendous job. So thank you all. It was just incredible. So as I start out here, I did grow up with pesticides. My grandfather was Dr. Carlisle Clayton, who taught at North Carolina State University for about 4 decades, developed 14 varieties of peach trees with his colleagues there, and also developed the pesticide spray programs for the Southeast and elsewhere for peaches, strawberries, apples, and other crops. And I worked on his farm. I was there the last year he was there on the farm. Worked with methyl bromide as we were fumigating the fields to plant tobacco, to plant the peach tree nursery. Worked in all of the various pesticides, every treated seed, everything was there. It's not a world I liked, but it was with a man I love, who was one of the most decent human beings who ever walked the face of the earth. But he had a different idea. He grew up with the boll weevil in South Carolina as a sharecropper and didn't have shoes until he was 5 or 6 years old. And so his idea was that he was going to try to make a better life for farmers so that people didn't have to live like him. I think it's important to remember that, there wasn't, and there probably still isn't, it wasn't all evil out there. There were people who were trying to find solutions. And he and I had lots of conversations on the porch, shelling beans and peeling peaches about what to do. So I'd like to think in this case that what I've been doing is not something where he's rolling over in his grave as he hears me speak around the country and elsewhere in the world, but I hope that he sees that I'm carrying on the lineage, because I think we're finding our way out of pesticides, and that's a really key piece here. So, I want to tell you a story, and I'm a Southerner, but I can do it fast, so stick with me here. So, stories are getting more complex to tell. Stories these days have to be not just text, not just photos, not just videos, not just web. They need to be all of it. So I've been very fortunate to be able to collaborate with Douglas Gayton and the rest of the folks in the Lexicon of Sustainability, where we've been able to tell this story in multiple formats. Obviously, there's the book, there's also the audio book version of it. There's this website, which I hope you'll check out, topplinggoliath.org, because that's what we're doing. We're toppling Goliaths. And Douglas has just been an incredible resource. And I'm finding here at the conference, folks don't know what he just finished in some cases. Douglas was hired by the NRCS to document organic farmers and farming practices all over the United States, and just finished up 2 years of a 2-year project and going all around the country, documenting those practices for the NRCS. And so now there's a website which the NRCS has up. There are the 5 videos that go with it that explain organic agriculture, those principles. If you want a free pop-up show like we have out here, except dedicated to United States organic farmers and farming practices, that's available at any NRCS office. There's a booklet that's also available that was, I believe, printed the day before Trump was inaugurated, just to make sure it got out there, several 100,000 copies. Those are free as well. And one of the NRCS folks told me, who she didn't know who I was or that I worked with Douglas, that this is the best document that I've had in my 25 years in NRCS to explain organic ag. So I hope you'll check it out. So I just want to acknowledge that it's been working with Douglas, and then also Pier Giorgio Provenzano, an Italian filmmaker, and Mickey Derakovilts, who's a dear friend. I knew him when he was in diapers. So this is a collaborative project, and it's a collaborative story, and I've just been blessed to be able to tell part of it. So working with Douglas, there are a couple things that I've learned that I think are really important for all of us as advocates. And one of those is, he says, we have to equate no food waste with no information waste. If we're going to go out there and we're going to try to capture and tell stories, in our case is traveling 9,000 miles, then there could be no information waste. We have to have ways of telling stories in as many vehicles as possible, and you never know what the full story is. So document, archive, and you never know where it's going to take you. The other thing that he emphasizes is we have to be platform agnostic in our activism. It's not just about the web. That doesn't reach everybody. It's not just the pop-up shows. That doesn't reach everybody. It's not just the books. So we have to get these stories out there in as many ways as possible. And don't assume you're going to get a grant to do it. We played that game. We didn't get it. It's a passion of love that we've done this with. And that's what we have to do. And it's taken 3 years of work, but it's been a privilege to be able to do it. And we need more of these stories because we haven't captured 5% of the marketplace by any measure in local, sustainable, organic. We have to be better storytellers. And so I hope this represents some of that. So this is me in 1993. This is in the South Tyrol region where I'm taking you on the quick tour here. This is harvesting grapes. This is at Brunenburg Castle in the Italian Alps in the South Tyrol region. And I was living and working there. I've lived there a total of about 4 years since 1983. I was living there for 3 years, managing the farm. And as it turned out, the farmer who was there died, just dropped dead after I was there for 6 months, and a sad scenario, but I ended up doing a lot more farming than I expected and ended up donning the pesticide respirator and also the rubber raincoat and everything else and spraying every 7, 10, 12 days and did that for 3 years. But majestic place to live. And this is Brunenburg Castle. This is where I was lucky enough to be and still go back. And the beginning of the story in many ways is right here. This is the beginning of the Finchgau Valley. And the Finchgau Valley is a very unusual place, as I'll show you. So the castle is right here, sits above Merano. And this is the mouth of the Finchgau Valley. And it goes up until you get to the end. On this side is Switzerland, on this side is Austria. And the very last little town that sits up here is the town of Maltz. And this is where things started to happen that I think not only changed the people's lives, but then also changed the world in some ways. So apples were nothing new. They came from Central Asia, probably made it over, maybe even in the time of the Romans, possibly, but certainly by the Middle Ages, they were in the South Tyrol region. This is from the 1930s. This is people picking apples, and it was a beloved crop. And in most cases, the markets were small at this point in time, and every farmer had an apple tree or 2 or 3, but that was about it. This is from the 1930s. This was taken directly below the castle. I almost could have thrown a rock. I'm not a very good thrower, but I almost could have done it. I probably would have hit the guy instead of the pesticide chamber there, or the barrel. So this is a wooden barrel. It's kind of funny. There's an oxen. They're probably spraying Viceroy, white oil, dormant oil in the winter here. And pesticides had been part and parcel of what they were doing from the 1860s, 1870s forward. So pesticides were nothing new to this region either. This is what apple growing looks like in the village where I spent all of my time in Dorf Tirol. Apples have taken over. We think of corn and soy here. If you translate corn and soy and you put it into apples, this is what it looks like. And they're utilizing the system that these growers picked up in 1973. Some of them went to the Netherlands to learn about the slender tree trellis system. It's the first time I've said that right in a public talk yet. And I'm not going to say it again. And so they learned this from the Dutch. This is with dwarf and semi-dwarf apple trees using a trellis system. As you can see here, hail nets are also part of it. You've got an irrigation system. Many of you know, it's a highly efficient system in many ways. It's easier to plant, it's easier to pick, it's easier to harvest, it's easier to spray, it's more efficient to spray, you use less pesticides if you're doing it right. And then they put these hail nets over the top. And when monocultures come, it's not just with pesticides, it also comes with changes in the landscape. And that's part of what the hail nets represent. They do save the farmers money, but they change the face of the landscape pretty dramatically. And so these hail nets, they protect from hail. They use them instead of crop insurance because they actually pay off in a much faster return. They also prevent some bird injury. They also prevent sun scald in some cases. So there are benefits to them. But it's an incredibly efficient apple system in the South Tyrol. If you eat an apple in Europe, there's a 1 in 7 chance that it comes from the South Tyrol. About 8% of the production there is organic. The rest is definitely not. The average use of pesticides is in the fruit industry in this region is 42 kilograms per hectare. So a hectare is 2.5 acres. It's the highest in Italy, probably. It depends on who you talk to, whose measure you use. One of the highest in Europe. But it also pays well, and that's why it's happening, because farmers can net, not gross, they can net per hectare between 25 and 40, even 45,000 euros. Most of the apple growers have about 4 hectares, so multiply that by 25,000 or by 40,000. It's a darn good income, especially when you don't pay income tax, which was a progressive thing in Italy, which went awry in this case. So you've got farmers making a lot of money off of apples here. And so there is that quintessential temptation of the apple that's sitting there waiting. So the story really goes back, and this is one of the things that I find that's just the most fascinating part of it, is that the Iceman, how many folks know the Iceman? Found in 1993. I was living there at the time, and actually my boss was the chief archaeologist for the province, and so there was a sandstorm that came off the Sahara, blew across the Mediterranean, and those tiny sand particles embedded in the glaciers were already impeded, they were already beginning to melt, but that sand accelerated it, and 2 tourists stumbled upon the cadaver here. And I was sitting at the table with my boss, Cizzo, and first night, well, they found someone, they think maybe World War I, maybe 1800s. The next night, it's like, well, it could be maybe 1600s. The next night, it's like, well, this is maybe pre-Middle Ages. And then finally, they realize 5,300 years old and perfectly preserved with not only his garments and all of his tools. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Everything was there at the site of the murder, as it turns out, or at least where he died as a result of an attack. But not only was that all there, but also his digestive system was intact. But it was gone. It disappeared because they were trying not to be invasive in the cadaver as they were studying it. And it's really hard to study a cadaver that comes out of a glacier and keep the humidity and the temperature just right. And so finally, after 10 years, they found his stomach, and it was hidden up under one of his lungs, and it was dehydrated. It was tiny. And the amazing thing there was that they found that the foods that he had ingested in the last 72 hours of his life, and as I understand it from the research, the last 72 hours you can basically track what someone ate during the last 72 hours of their life. And so they found in there emmer, einkorn, spelt, millet, barley. They also found 2 kinds of smoked meat, one that was probably domesticated, one that was wild. They also found carbonized remains that suggested that he was eating bread. They also found out that he was probably somewhat lactose intolerant, but actually came from a dairy culture. So all of a sudden, 5,300 years of history, it's all right there, and it was sitting right above the Finchgau Valley, right above where this story was born. So that's part of the reason the story is so fascinating, is there was a lot to protect in this particular town of Maltz. So Ötzi was found right up here in the glacier here, right not too far from Maltz, actually this way a little bit. And he was a discovery that really sort of rattled everybody's cages and still does. So this is Maltz, and I need to explain Maltz just a little bit. Maltz it's a municipality, so it's a township. It's comprised of 11 different villages. It's 95 square miles. It's an extraordinary place that I'll introduce you to here in just a second. And I was leading a study tour of my graduate students there in 2014, and my dear friend Brigida, who was one of my mentors there, she said, this was 2 days before we were about to set out with the bus tours and go different places. She said, well, in Maltz, they're having a referendum to ban all pesticides. I was like, what? I mean, you don't talk bad about pesticides in the South Tyrol. You basically don't talk about them, much like the communities that we have here. And I couldn't believe it. And she said, well, it's real. So I changed the schedule, got one of the hired buses to take us up and meet a local guest owner. And that was really, for me, where this story began. So we went up to this guest house, which turns out is an ancient building in and of its right, and we got the story recounted to us by one of the local innkeepers there, who told us what was happening and started to give us the history. And so my students and I started the interview and documentation process without realizing where we were headed. This is Maltz in I believe in the 1940s. Gives you a little bit of a sense of the perspective. This actually is a church from the 800s, has frescoes on the inside of bakers and shepherds. It's just astounding. These are the shocks of the grain, probably, I think Sitso said he thought those were probably barley, and then potatoes here in the field. So you start to get a sense of what this place looks like. And this is it, I believe, in the 1970s. So, very diversified agriculture, really magnificent in many ways. And it's got these nucleated settlements, as the anthropologists call them. So you've got the towns and the farmers, because they were here between Switzerland and Austria, modern day Switzerland and Austria and Italy. It was this place of cultural confluence, but also potential devastation. And so the farms, the barns are actually inside the villages, in some cases inside the village walls, and the fields themselves are outlying. So these fields, and this is an important part of the story, tended to be anywhere from half a hectare to maybe 2 hectares in some cases. And so on a fairly small scale. This is malts 2 summers ago, and there's a change, which you might notice. That's these dark green spots. These are the apple orchards. These are the apple orchards that are starting to move in from the lower part of the valley. So the story, in many ways, it's a kind of a multiple conspiracies, one of them being climate change, because apple growers not only had a lot of money now, and so there was the potential for land grabbing, but they also could grow apples higher and higher and higher. And malts was the coveted spot. It was the last place to grab the land and to get it fairly inexpensively. And so the maltsers knew what was coming, and I'll show you what was coming. So this is malts, all of this. You get a sense here, the mowed fields for hay. One of the villages there, Planile. One of the other villages high up. These are all hay fields, grazing areas. Grazing areas go up. Really tight clustered houses. Highest Benedictine monastery in all of Central Europe. This is the local agricultural school. They don't like organic sometimes. Monastery, biodynamic vineyard now, thanks to the new abbot. So now the apples start to see them marching their way into malts. Alpine lakes, high pastures, grazed all summer. Same here again. Shepherd's hut, woman running inside to hide. They like the privacy in Europe. So when the Iceman was found higher than all of these places, he was found at 3,300 meters. This is the highest mountain in that region. Apple and cherry orchards. This is an ancient Neolithic cultic site. May go back as far as the time of Ötzi the Iceman. Put a church on top of it, make sure you claim it. They found some of the old grains up there as well, and the carbonized remains. Receding glaciers. And this is the Ortler, the highest mountain, 3,900 meters. Suicide March. Yeah, and Red Bull sponsored it. I don't know why. Yes, got to get your high somehow. So that gives you a little bit of sense of the perspective here. And the other thing that's important to note is this is also a very broad valley, and it's considered a steppe region. It's one of the driest. So 300 days of sunshine a year, perfect for growing apples, with water sources coming from all sides. So pretty amazing territory for apples. But this is the middle Finchgau. This is in the middle of the valley, is about halfway up. And this is what they're facing there. And this gives you a sense of the landscape of how intense it is. And it's so bad that, as it turns out, this particular family, Urban here, decided, I believe it was when he turned 40, that he wanted to start an organic herb business. And he actually wanted to cut down all the apple trees that his family had and start an organic herb business. And that's a long story that I go into in the book that's really fascinating in and of itself. But finally, he got his wife and everyone else to buy into it. So his parents, his father was a stonemason, one of his sons was a good electrician and builder and a computer guy and designer. So the family came together, 3 generations, to build this business, turned it into a very successful organic herb business, only to have apples move in on every side. And the apples moved in to the degree that they were literally, the first thing they tried to do was get bigger trees, grow hedges really fast to try to see if that would work. That didn't work. Then they installed what the best translation is a water curtain. So all around, they established these sprayers that would shoot water walls up 10 meters, so 30 feet high whenever the spraying was happening to try to catch the pesticide drift. That didn't work. Then they said either we're going to have to leave, or the other thing is cover our entire farm with high tunnels. And so, which they decided to do. $250,000 later, they'd covered the entire farm. It's actually the safest place for the grandkids, the 4th generation now, to play, is underneath all of this because of the heavy pesticide use. And they've suffered as a result, and they knew that they had to do something different. So what Urban did, one of the things, was to start taking videos. And he gave me on a thumb drive the best hits 2016, best hits 2015. And so he's been going around taking videos of the pesticide spraying that's going on to show just how errant it is sometimes. So part of what you're seeing is the fact that you have the thermal updraft. Part of it is you've got sprayers now that actually have smaller droplets, and so the aerosols are being lifted up, taken away. And you have a valley that has a wind that has its own name, the Finchgewind, which is the Finchgau wind. And that's because it'll blow for 3 weeks at a time sometime. I've been out there in the vineyards, and it'll drive you crazy because it just doesn't stop. So farmers are going to end up spraying in the wind. So at this point, in various places around the South Tyrol, they found the different pesticides analyses have revealed the pesticide contents even in the 2,000-meter lakes up above because of these thermal updrafts. So the people in Maltz knew what was coming. I mean, they literally could smell it. And as it turned out, unfortunately, there's a canary in every coal mine. And this guy had to be that guy. His name is Gunther Wallnerfer. He's a farmer who, in 2001, decided that the only way to save his family farm was to convert to organic. And he felt good about it. He said, this is the way my forefathers did it. He said, it just makes sense. We've known since the time of the Iceman how to do this. And so he'd gone organic, and then in 2009, apple orchard popped up, apple orchard popped up. 2010, he goes out to do his hay crop. He knows as an organic farmer he has to take samples. He has 3 cuts per year. The samples during the first cut, and he has to pay 250 euros out of his own pocket for every analysis, multiple analysis for each cutting. So pesticide residues in the first cut in the samples. Second cut, pesticide residues. Third cut, same thing. His certifier said, well, obviously, you've got to feed your cattle something different. Not only that, you also have to get the hay off the premises because we consider it toxic at this point. And so Gunther said, what was I supposed to do? Sell it to a neighbor knowing it's tainted, a conventional dairy farmer knowing it's tainted? Destroy it? Where do I take it? The landfill? And so he was in a real quandary. And he went to the new mayor, and the mayor's name is Ulrich, or as everybody in town knows him, Uli. He went to Uli, he said, listen, this is not just about me, but I'm facing this problem and it's going to increase. Because here we have the first organic hotel in the region. Organic hotels are pretty amazing. They've really not hit the United States very much yet. So all the cleaning products that they use, all the food that you're served, everything has to be organic certified. They also had a whiskey distillery because part of what they were doing is trying to bring this grain renaissance back of all these ancient grains, because this was actually known as the breadbasket of the South Tyrol. The Vatican took grains from the South Tyrol. The royal family in England also cherished the grains that they had. And so he said to Uli, we've got all these organic farmers that are starting to do things. What are we going to do? Because it's not just me anymore. It's the whole economy. And Uli had been working in Switzerland for about 14 years. He just drove across the border, working in Switzerland. And he'd kind of been infused with this notion of direct democracy, because the Swiss really have that down better than anyone else in the world, perhaps, of using public referendums to express different ideas and get them on ballots and advance things forward. And so when he came back, he was never in politics, never was in a political party, but he wanted to come back and create a sustainable community. He wanted to create the organic or bioregion of the Upper Finchgau. And so they had a train that the Swiss had designed that was bringing people in and out. They converted that to electric after they installed more hydro for all of the electricity in town, so they were self-sufficient in electricity, helping to provide the train, setting up a car share program for people that didn't have cars, doing everything they could to try to be a sustainable community. And Uli said, this is just going to shatter all of the dreams that we had here. And there were folks like Edith, and I'll give you just a sampling of some of the people, who was a seed saver, who in 1991, she and her husband retired, and people thought they were crazy. They were out saving these different varieties of grains at that point in time, and all sorts of vegetable varieties and herbs and flowers. And she'd even found one grain, it was from 93 in a neighbor's roof, and grew it out. And so now other farmers are growing that out. And she and her husband, Robert, have this interesting way to keep their marriage intact, as they say. She takes care of everything above the soil. He takes care of everything below ground. So compost is his deal. And they've been the models now for organic practices in the community. And then people like Helga and Edward. And Helga married into the family, and she saw Edward's father spraying the roses in the garden and setting up cardboard barriers. And she said, this is crazy. There's no need for the pesticides. And from now on, this farm will be organic. And so not only do they raise a good bit of their own food, including the grains, but then they do the grains, they do the harvesting, they also do the bread baking, and they educate other farmers and young people and tourists as they come through. And then this is Conrad, who first told me the story, who has this guest house where you don't know what you're going to get when you go there. It's whatever he's in the mood to cook and give you, but you can darn well better believe that it's going to be organic, it's going to be fresh, and it's going to be hyper-local when you get there. And then Franz the baker, the third generation of a bakery here in town, where actually this sourdough starter is a couple of years older than Franz is. And they've kept that alive, and it's used primarily with rye because that's one of the traditional grains. And he's been trying to buy as much organic and local as he can. And he needs more people to be growing it so he has a better supply. And then you have Aegidius, and this is the person I so wish I'd met back in the 1990s, because my boss at the castle, Sitzo, was saying, find me an example of somebody doing it organic. And he said, I don't like the pesticides either, but I need to see it. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it with my grandfather when he gave me the same challenge in North Carolina in the 1980s, 1990s. I just could not find them there. But Aegidius was a conventional apple farmer who 30 years ago decided that he would not only park the sprayer, but just get rid of the sprayer. He doesn't even, as an organic farmer, he doesn't use copper, he doesn't use sulfur, he doesn't use compost. He basically turns everything on its head. In fact, this is a metal-handled scythe, and he's taken the blade off of the scythe. He's like, Aegidius, what are you doing walking around with this thing? And he only uses his tractor twice per year. He plants at half the density of all the other fruit farmers. And so what he does is he mows down the rows once a year. It's the last week of June, first week of July. He does the mowing. But then between the trees, he just walks along with this scythe, and with it turned upside down, as he does everything, turns it on its head, he uses it to whack and break the stems in order to maintain the fertility and the biodiversity there. He said, I just don't want to interrupt that, because it's that natural cycle, much like we've talked about at the conference, that keeps it there. And when I walked through his farm, he would hand me fruit after fruit as we walked tree by tree, grapevine by grapevine. And if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have believed it. It was extraordinary. So he's a real model, and there are those out there that are as good as Aegidius. And then you have what we've been talking about as well, folks like Evelyn, who her mother grew up on one of these traditional farms where they grew everything. Basically, the sugar and the coffee they would bring in, but most everything else they would raise on her hardscrabble farm. But then Evelyn started suffering from some food allergies, and then her son even more severely. So they started going back and bringing their mother in and teaching them how to either raise food or source food or cook food, process it. And this is kind of all of these, I don't know if you've noticed, we made up all these German words. They're real German words, but they're compounds. Douglas, this was his idea, is like, Germans do this shit all the time. Why can't we? And so we're like, okay, this will be fun. And so in this case, there's a German expression where we just made up the word, the family peering beyond the edge of their plates. And so then there's the town veterinarian who grew up there. And you think about the veterinarian as the person, especially a large animal vet who's traveling around. They see the landscape. They understand the people. They're inside the barns. They're inside the houses. They see the livestock. They see the landscape changes. And Peter was really one of the guardians of the landscape and one of the environmentalists who's been working on this for 30 years. And he was going to do his darndest to make sure that pesticides didn't come heavily into his community. And then Alexander Agatley, just an incredible cheesemaker, because of having to live there in town with the barn, he could only have 12 cows to milk. That was it. That was the limit. There was no other way around it. So the way that he decided to do it was to make cheese. So he had this brilliant idea. He went to the Italian tax authorities. He said, I want to print my own currency. They're like, what? He said, well, I'm checking with you, so this is above board. I want to print my own currency, and the farm's name is the Engelhorn, and I want to call the currency, I want to call the bills the Engelhorner. And they're like, well, it's not illegal, so I guess as long as you report it, it's okay. So he sold currency in 10-year increments. Each Engelhorn was worth 1 kilo of cheese. So that he raised 160,000 euros to build his cheese cave using that. So people would get their currency in increments over the period of 10 years. Not only can you use the currency there to buy your cheese, you can go to Munich or a couple of other places to hotels that buy his cheese. You pay an Engelhorner for the hotel, and they buy the cheese. So it's brilliant, really extraordinary. And he's organic. And he said, I'm doomed if the pesticides come. So they got cheeky, as they would say, and so Alexander and some of the others formed an organization called Adam and Äpfel. Äpfel is the dialect word for apple, but sounds like Eve as well. And so they formed this informal organization, and this is for the young folks and others. This is when things get fun. So they decided that they would start having these meetings to envision what they did want. They knew what they didn't want, but they weren't agreed upon what they did want to do. So they decided that this was in 2013. All of this stuff was unfolding with the different farmers being concerned. So they decided they'd employ guerrilla art. And so they made this map, and this map was basically you could either walk or you could bike or you could take the car, or you could take the train and go from village to village because they wanted to show what was at risk, what was going to potentially happen if they succumbed to the temptation of the apple. So this was the big day. So the wooden snakes appeared in the orchards in various forms. There was an Eve in every village, or at least nearby, offering the temptation of the apples. There were snake serpents representing what could come that were placed in hayfields and other places, real snakes that showed up in various places. And then also with the whiskey distillery, that's when things got really fun. But they turned everything into an event and utilized this guerrilla art to show what was really at risk. And so over the course of the next year, a lot of things happened. There were over 24, by the time they hit 2014 in the referendum, they'd had 24 public meetings. They brought in the best lawyers, toxicologists, people from other towns who'd made somewhat similar moves, spent a lot of time doing that, and then a year later decided they'd do the same thing. And so they created the map in the same way, but this time they wanted to celebrate what they had. And so here's the biodynamic winery that was set up, so doing wine tastings. Here doing different vegetables and meats that came from the area, talking about bees and what was going to happen with the bees if the pesticides came in. And for the first time, the crazies, Robert and Edith, had their grains all displayed in these beautiful cases, labeling where they came from. They paid for it out of their pocket, but this display is magnificent, and it shows the biodiversity there, and it's actually been all over Europe. Now, if you go somewhere to find them at a seed market, they'll be the place with the biggest crowd, and they'll sell out of seeds before anyone else does. So this is a tribute to Warren, who I really appreciated his quote. There's a translation problem, though. When you talk about a molecular bull in the china shop, it doesn't work in German. The expression is an elephant in the china shop. So we made up another word. So we have the molecular elephants in the china shop, talking about all the pesticides that were possible. And there's a listing. It's in English if you'd like to look at it it's called Agrios, where there's a listing of all the accepted practices or accepted pesticides for IPM. So we listed as many as we could squeeze into one artwork, but there were several hundred more we could have gotten on there. And they utilized the precautionary principle. And there are different ways of looking at the precautionary principle. For them, it was critical. It's much more a part of what happens in Europe than it is here. That's been a theme that's been resounding throughout the conference here. And so there were important people who picked up on that. And one was the town pharmacist, who ended up he was elected to be the spokesperson. And when you think about it, who do you want in a village to be your spokesperson? The person that deals in parts per million and parts per billion all the day. The person who knows and works by the dose makes the poison. So you have someone who's articulate, who understands how to address so many of these issues. And so Johannes, the pharmacist, quite the character, he teamed up with another person in town, Elizabeth Viertler, the pediatrician. And Elizabeth's belief is that the environment is really the first factor in medicine. And so Elizabeth stepped in, the two of them got together, and they wrote a manifesto. And it's not just that they wrote a manifesto. They got every person with a doctorate, every person who worked in environmental and human health to sign on in the region except for 3. Every doctor, dentist, veterinarian, environmental biologist, all of those folks except for, I believe it was 3, signed on to the manifesto and then stated why they thought it was important. But things still weren't really rolling, and just as you've got the empty chairs here, they could be filled. We can bring those folks down. It was the women that made the difference, because the media and the politicians still weren't paying attention to what the Maltzers were asking for. And so it's kind of a funny story, because Martina just moved back from Zurich. She grew up in Maltz, and she went to the hairdresser, to Beatrice, who is now, she was one of the very first organic hairdressers in all of Italy as a result of all of this. It's a certification process. She said, after I got so concerned about pesticides, how could I put heavy metals into people's heads? And she's just extraordinary. And she was recognized, she got the prize for being the award for being the most successful organic hairdresser in all of Europe 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. But they had this quiet conversation because no one else was there in the shop. And Martina said, listen, I just got back and I just don't understand why people aren't up in arms about what's happening. What is it? And Beatrice said, I don't know. Martina said, well, what if I write a letter to the editor? Will you take it around? You still know everybody. And you take the letter around and see how many people you can get to write different letters. And she said, okay. Here's the funny part for Irvine. Martina's sister, I just had breakfast with her. She lives in Irvine. So awesome. She really wanted to come tonight, but I was totally blown away. I got an email 2 days ago. Can you meet, from Martina's husband, can you meet my sister-in-law? Yes. But these women ended up getting together, and I'll show you a little bit of what they did. So the first thing was to write that letter and to have multiple people sign on. And the local paper, to their credit, they published it, all the different versions of the letter that came in. And they were really smart. Here they put bitte, please, because what they were asking for was the mayor to protect the health of the community. And in the EU, the mayor, and in Italy, the mayor has the right to do whatever is necessary to protect the health of their community. And so in this case, it was a very powerful call, and that's when the politicians started to get nervous. So then they took it to the next level. They spent the good part of one night inside a local barn filling Tyvek pesticide suits with hay and then putting all the pesticide warning labels on them. And so under the cover of darkness before dawn, they took them to the center square, the town square where the farmers market is the next day, set them up in strategic places all around the farmers market, informing people of what the dangers of pesticides were. And nobody really knew where they came from. Oh, and I should say, they also at that point, they adopted the name, the informal name that they still have, which is Holevint, which means in dialect, stop right there, watch out, don't take another step. And so it's a really powerful word. In fact, they have a campaign now. You can go online. They asked me to tell folks in the US, you can go to the holevint.com website and you have to use less than 1,200 characters and put a photo of yourself and a statement about why you think we should have a pesticide-free world. So they're trying to have 1,000 of those by the end of the year. And so then they had this campaign that was really in some ways the most extraordinary piece, and that was turning bed sheets into banners. This was the case in which Martina and the rest of the women got together. They said, we're going to do a banner campaign. And if you're in a tourist community, you got bed sheets left over all over the place. So they did very professional stenciling. They kept it kind of quiet, ended up having several hundred banners that were going to be hung up in the cover of darkness one night in the summer. Nobody knew exactly who was going to hang things up. And as it turned out, in the process of talking about it, doing the stenciling, the beekeeper, Pia Oswald, said, you know what? We cannot use the words no, not, never, or ban. Nothing negative, just as the women here were saying. It has to be a positive campaign. We're looking for a pesticide-free future. We're not looking to ban pesticides. And that was the game changer. That was the key to success in so many ways, because suddenly the polarization diminished by virtue of that. So this says that the town of Malt's free from pesticides. And this is one that still remains, that's up. Protect and use our landscape, keep it free from pesticides for us and for our guests. The agricultural economy only makes up about 6%. The tourist economy makes up about 25%. So they were tackling the tourist industry at the same time. So lots of wisdom in that. And even the abbot, who was dealing with monks who were using pesticides, told the monks that they need to be pesticide-free, and he actually allowed them to hang one of the banners in front of the monastery, which was pretty astounding. So they had this referendum, had it in 2014. They wanted to keep it open. They wanted to make sure that if they knew the lawsuits would come, but they wanted it to be unchallenged. So 2-week voting period. The mayor had to be quiet the entire time. The town council had to be quiet the entire time. They had 3 different ways you could vote. You could vote in person, you could at the poll, you could do a 24-hour drop box, or you could do an absentee ballot. And as it turned out, 69% of the voting electorate voted, and they got almost 76% of the people to vote for a pesticide-free future, which was awesome. And and nobody else in the world has quite done it that way. So. And they adopted the sunflower as their motif. And during the polling period, one thing that did happen, magically every day, sunflowers would appear in the water troughs and the water fountains all around town, and sunflowers would appear in strange places and on the streets. And the amazing thing too is it took them 1.5 years to write the ordinances. And those ordinances, just April 1st of this year, just went into effect. Everybody's been waiting with bated breath to see what would happen. And what they did, again, very savvy, they banned the 2 most toxic classes of pesticides, of synthetic pesticides, outright. They had to figure out a way to make sure this thing didn't get knocked out in court immediately. So this is the really savvy piece, which can seem like a compromise, but what they did was set up a 50-meter buffer for the use of any of the other classes of pesticides. The parcels are too small. A 50-meter buffer doesn't exist. And so they put that in there, and it was just extraordinary. So I'm sure that it will end up in court in various ways. There are lawsuits flying. The Farmers Association is paying for the farmers to have lawsuits against the mayor, against the spokesperson, against the town council. But they're standing up and they're holding firm. And then the other thing they did was they said, it's not about local and then organic. It has to be about organic. So we're going to help fund in whatever ways we can farmers to transition to organic. We're going to educate people about organic. We're going to serve organic foods, only organic foods in our schools, and we're going to start with the kindergarten. And the kindergarten is 100% organic now. So things don't come simply sometimes. So this is a Gideus. This is in the last week of September this year. So someone came and they sprayed glyphosate in his orchard. Yeah. And they didn't just spray a little bit. So what he's saying here is, here in my orchard, I've sent all of this off for analysis. And there's glyphosate in the orchard that I've tended for 30 years, not even with copper or sulfur, no amendments whatsoever. Sprayed with glyphosate. Lost as a result his entire crop for this past year. Certification for the next several years. Then we emailed back and forth a little bit, and after things settled a bit, there was the community gathered a fund, put that together to help support him and his family. And he said, this is the cost of what you have to do in advocacy sometimes. These things happen. He said, if it means we're still advancing the agenda, he said, I'm willing to take that burden on for the rest of the community, but still pretty brutal. So Johannes, and these are on the website. I'll leave these for you to check out on the Toppling Goliath website. We have an activist toolkit that should be there pretty shortly as well. But Johannes gave us a prescription for successful collective action that I think is really powerful and compelling and spot on. And this is what he thinks other communities can do. I'll leave that for you to check out on the website. And then there were folks like Kuhn, who he's worked for Swiss Air and Hertz car rental. He got involved. He said, I'm the citizen. I have to be there. I have to be part of the voice. So he was the co-founder of Pan Italia with one other Maltzer, because they knew they needed a bigger network, that they couldn't sustain this over the long haul without others. He's now the treasurer of Pan Pesticide Action Network EU. And he also did a study which was just incredible, of sampling 71 different schoolyards throughout the South Tyrol because the government refuses to do it. So the protocols were incredibly tight. I mean, this was citizen science at its best. And so he did the sampling. I reviewed the paper in October, and he just emailed me 2 days ago to say that the Journal of Environmental Toxicology is interested in publishing the paper. So we'll hope that happens. So you never know where these things are going to take you and what they're going to ask of you. And the results weren't pleasant, I'll tell you that. So Pan EU has picked up on this. There's now this initiative for pesticide-free communities that is going throughout all of Europe. This is Francois Villaret, who is the head of Pan EU. He said in his 30 years of pesticide activism in Europe, he's never seen a scenario like this. This is under the Glitter's High Tunnel. Switzerland got wind of this and used their own devices, and so they had a public referendum, in order to have a public referendum, they needed 100,000 signatures to move toward having, they were suggesting that they have a referendum for Switzerland to be pesticide-free over a transition period of 10 years. They got over 200,000 signatures. Will it pass? I think it's going to be tough, but one never knows. And then one of the coolest things happened. Vandana Shiva was gracious enough to write the foreword for the book, and then she invited me and Uli over, and so this is Uli, and she wanted to have a shaking of hands and had created this ceremony in New Delhi because she wanted the people in the Himalayas to connect with the people in the Alps who were fighting for poison-free communities. And if you go online, you can sign the pledge for a poison-free future that Vandana is pushing forward. And she brought together the Minister of Sikkim, who has been reelected 5 times. And the platform has been to make Sikkim, the Indian state of Sikkim, 100% organic. And they're just about there. She invited several Bhutanese, and they also are moving forward and having 100% organic by virtue of the king pushing that forward. So there's a lot of hope out there. The thing for me that's changed in all of this and thinking about the story a lot, I've been teaching the organic agriculture, and I've been putting the weight on organic farmers and on consumers. And I think what we have to realize, and it's the theme of this conference in so many ways, is we have to do this at the community level. We can't ask those people to bear all the burden. That this really is about communities doing this work and finding effective ways. And that's what means so much about all of this. And when I go back to Brunenburg Castle and I go back to the vineyard, the kid who was 4, 5, and 6 while I was there and would help me do everything also wanted to help me spray pesticides. It's like, Nick, get away from the hose. You can't be here while I'm spraying. And please go away. So the vineyard is his now. He's gone in, he's taken the Vitis vinifera vines, and he's cut every one. And he's put 17 different varieties of fungal-resistant vines there. He no longer sprays anything. No copper, no sulfur. It's 100% organic. What he has to do now is figure out the marketplace, because the wines taste a little bit different. They look a little bit different. So he's figuring out of those 17 different varieties, which ones grow well there, which ones make a good wine on their own, which wines can be blended. And then finally, he makes up names that sound a little bit like Vitis vinifera for the wines, just to pull people in. So for me, that really is the biggest hope, and that's the message we have to carry forward. So thank you.